Hello, good morning, and welcome to another session of the ACA Global Markets with Jim Fitzpatrick. Indeed, this is the 99th edition since the inception in 2020. We are building up to the big one, the 100th edition in 2 weeks. Have you ever wondered why raw cashew nut prices never match kernel prices? Well, today we will try to understand this. Be part of the discussion. Share your comments and questions in the Q&A box. As always, this session is available in both French and English. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen. We are also streaming live on the official ACA Facebook page and YouTube channel. Feel free to follow and share with your network. The session is brought to you by the African Cashew Alliance ACA with the kind support of the European Union EU, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States OACPS, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Projects, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Before I hand you over to Jim, we would like to specially invite you to the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place in Accra, Ghana from 15th to 18th September 2026. Join hundreds of cashew stakeholders to network, share experiences, and discuss the future of the industry. Online registration is now open. Visit www.africancashewalliance.com to secure your spot. And now to lead us in today's discussion is our regular host, Jim Fitzpatrick. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Isaac. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you too?
Yeah, all good, thanks. All good. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. You're very welcome. As Isaac was saying, we're going to talk about a subject which has always been a bit of a puzzle to me as well as to many people. Why is there never, as they say sometimes, you'll hear people say there's no parity. Why do RCN prices never match the kernel's market or never match at that moment? And that's the idea for that came to me when I was at a meeting with an important buyer of cashew kernels, and they just asked me that question, and the question they asked was, is there ever a day when you can buy raw cashew nuts and sell cashew kernels on the same day and make a profit margin, or at least make an acceptable profit margin? And my initial answer was no, there isn't. But then I thought, let's have a look. Let's see exactly if we can figure out if that's right or not. But before we go to that, we're going to talk about the markets. We'll have a quick overview of the markets. We'll have a look at some of the production updates, particularly from our African Cashew Alliance reporters, the contributors to the ACA splits, which you'll be familiar with if you're a member of the African Cashew Alliance. And we'll have a look at a few small points on demand. It's early in the year really to be analyzing demand, but we'll have a look at a few small pointers. So let's get into it, and let's first of all have a quick look at the trends. So far I'm seeing that the crop estimates in West Africa especially are improving in terms of the size of the crop. The crop in Cote d'Ivoire, the second crop is coming. Quality remains an issue. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. Farm gate prices, most places are weakening a little bit. That's with quality and with greater availability. But raw cashew nut prices in the international market remain relatively steady. And we're looking at two things, I think: the market power of some of the larger traders, and we're looking at the impact of cash flow in the system or lack of it. Raw cashew nut imports in Vietnam in April hit a new record, remarkable number. And we'll have a look at that a little bit later too. Kernels prices, though, do look a little bit weaker. probably on more supply, but certainly some of the offers coming from processors in Vietnam, right across the spectrum, right across from the very top packers with the best quality, all the way down to the lower end of the spectrum. Everyone's dropped their prices back a little bit more at the bottom end than at the top end, but it's pretty much the same trend. And maybe that's linked to what might be seen as a slight wavering of the trend in demand. Remember last year we had record growth in demand, record growth in some markets like China, like India. And now we might be seeing that slow down a little bit. And that's due to the continued impact of the war, I think. Is it a trend? Well, we'll have a little bit of a look at that shortly. Meantime, policy, and we're really talking West Africa again, policy in West Africa is impacting supply and is impacting costs. And that's a really important factor, as we'll see, for our question today on raw cashew nuts and cashew kernel price relationships. So let's have a look at supply. Let's have a look at production. Quick overview of the situation. Starting with Cambodia, certainly it looks like this crop in Cambodia is turning out quite well. If we look at imports by Vietnam, which is a pretty good measure, 823,000 tons plus at the end of April, that's really quite a positive figure. I wouldn't be surprised now if Cambodia touches on 1 million tons again this year. It's a longer harvest than expected. The weather has got a little bit better, and it could be that this one is another massive crop in Cambodia. Bearing in mind, new trees are maturing. Some new trees are coming online for the first time this year, as last year. So the impact of some poor weather early on may well, in the end, be offset by those two factors. What about Vietnam? Well, harvest-wise, the peak season is gone. The weather has become really good for drying, for harvesting, and the crop estimate remains a pretty good crop, maybe around average. But of course, Vietnam is not a major producer these days. India, well, time is moving on nicely in India. The weather conditions have improved. There was, if you remember, 2 weeks ago, we talked about too much rain in some areas, too dry in others, patchy weather conditions. That appears to have improved, and the crop is coming into its final phase. It's still a working number around 780,000 tons. That's mainly from the official bodies. We'll get a better idea on that as the weeks go on. Critical time is, when does the southwest monsoon start? So in Asia, the three producers of note at this time of year showing pretty good production, no real sign of any difficulty, and that's a big turnaround from some of the talk that we heard back in February. So let's go halfway around the world and let's go to West Africa. And we'll start with the world's biggest producer, Cote d'Ivoire. 26% share of world production last year. Latest update I have is 1.15 million tons arrived. That is pretty close to where we were this time last year. Processors have been active, almost 700,000 tons. That leaves exporters with 459,000 tons. And the CCIK, the regulator, tells us they think there's about 200,000 tons left. So the second crop is coming in. Now, the big issue right now is quality. It's been an issue throughout the season. We started the year comparing to 2025, which was an excellent year for quality. So the fact that it's lower than last year is no surprise. But it does now look actually lower than average quality too. Some 42 pounds, some 43 pounds, even some lower in some areas. And as time goes on, that tends to drop down as well. So this is a tricky one because you've got a fixed farm gate price and falling quality. How do you manage that? But the volume is good, as you can see. And another factor which is negative for farm gate prices is, of course, the availability of cash. So if traders looking at a risk, particularly international traders, slowed the injection of cash into the system, then you get tight cash flow. Tight cash flow means not enough money to buy. Not enough money to buy means falling prices. And that is causing strain. If you're legitimate processor, trader, exporter, you're still paying the at minimum of 400 CFA at the farm gate, but there definitely will be trade below that now at this point. It's impossible. I'm not saying that the minimum price is a bad idea, but it is impossible to implement that right across the chain, and particularly when it's an arbitrary number without adjustment for quality during the season. So that gives a slightly, and I say slightly, weaker tone to export prices of raw cashew nuts in the international market. Kernels, on the other hand, holding up really well. Good demand for kernels from Cote d'Ivoire. The better the quality, the better the price, but the range still remains way above the prices in Vietnam for reasons of quality, traceability, location, and some of the other factors that we've spoken about on this event many times before. So right now we think, and we've upgraded our estimate for Cote d'Ivoire a little bit. We think the crop is lower than last year, but it's not lower by more than 200,000 tons. That means 1.35 million tons. That's a really good crop. We also think that the processors will not process 700,000 tons this year. It will be more than last year, I think. Several reasons for that. One is it's going to be a really difficult year because of the quality. Two is the subsidies have been removed. Three, the jump from around about 450,000 tons processed to 700,000 tons processed is a big one. And don't forget that it's one thing to build a factory, it's quite another to get that factory up to capacity. It can be done, but it takes time. So I don't think 700,000 tons will be processed. So some of that material may come back out into the market. And that probably shows a weakness in the window system, in that you can buy as a processor during the harvest season when exporters cannot, but you don't necessarily have to process that material. Obviously, you won't get a subsidy if you don't process it, but you could resell it as raw cashew nuts. And of course, the whole system becomes rather blurred when you realize that many of the major traders and exporters of raw cashew nuts are actually also the major processors. So it looks to me as if pretty difficult year for processing, but there will be improvement. Not as bad a crop as was originally thought by many, but quality remains an issue. There is an old saying that big crops get bigger, but in the cashew business, it seems to be that small crops get bigger. And that's about market information. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. Elsewhere in Africa, let's have a look. So Nigeria, and again, thanks to our AfriCashew Splits, ACA's magazine, market magazine, thanks to the reporters for some of the feedback and some of the market information over the last 10 days. Now we're looking at a crop in Nigeria. I think this could be around about 300,000 tons. That's a good crop. 280,000 tons exported so far was one report. Hard to believe, but don't forget there's a lot of material flowing in from Benin. It'll flow more to Nigeria this year because the system in Togo is more difficult. So it's believable, but it is quite a big number. And of course, most of that has not arrived either in India or Vietnam yet. Ghana coming to an end. Still, we have this official estimate of 250,000 tons. I just can't see that as being right. I think more realistically, a crop of 150,000 tons, maybe less. That's not a bad crop, by the way, compared to other years. I feel that the official estimate is overstating the situation. Exports, they tell us so far, and this is up to last week, 150,000 tons. That will include not only Ghanaian material, but some of the Burkina material that was shipped before the suspension, and it will include some material that comes across the border from Ivory Coast too. In Benin, what are we hearing? Well, we're hearing that this crop is probably not as bad in quality as might have been originally estimated by some. We hear that processors have bought about 60,000 tons, a little bit more than last year. But if the crop estimate of 200,000 tons, the trade estimate that is correct, then there is a significant illegal export flow across borders, and that would tend to explain the estimated Nigerian export figure at this stage. But a lot of these figures, trade figures, production figures in West African countries, in the current situation, they're estimates. For some, they're guesstimates, um, but they're not far off reality. So we should look at them rather as trends rather than statistics at this stage. But generally speaking, it's going in the right direction from a production size point of view. Burkina Faso, well, you'll know if you're interested in raw cashew nuts that export is restricted by the quota system so that processors can be supplied. There's got to be a question mark now about storing raw material in the longer term, the quality of the infrastructure. If it's not already with processors, what's the quality of the warehouses? Where is the material stored and how well will it retain its quality over the coming weeks until the export restrictions are lifted? They tell us that about 100,000 tons was exported before the suspension of exports. That's up. The previous figure we'd heard was 70,000 tons. I'm just going to say it's between 70 and 100. That seems to be about right. That would be reflected in the Ghanaian exports. So you can see the pattern in West Africa. We're often putting a jigsaw together. So what went out of Burkina, what went into Ghana, what went out of Ghana, what went out of Benin into Nigeria, how does that affect their export figure? And in that environment, if you don't look at the full puzzle, it's really easy to come to the wrong conclusions. So if you didn't know about cross-border flows from Benin in Nigeria, you could easily be forgiven for estimating the crop up around 400,000 tons. So we need to be careful. When we look at one dimension, for example, export, volume, that we take into account where that material came from. And this is one of the problems that's been dogging policy in West Africa for some years. A kind of a one-dimensional, slightly misinformed approach by policymakers. Let's look elsewhere. Let's move west. Senegal. Crop definitely later, crop maybe a bit lower. You remember 2 weeks ago, if you were with us, Samrit Kurian told us about what he was seeing there, and this pretty much reflects that. The export tax at $65 has been introduced. That may well impact the cross-border flows. We saw last year the return of heavy flow of raw material, raw cashew nuts from Guinea-Bissau into Senegal for export. That's to do with logistics, it's to do with costs, it's to do with cash flow. This year, there are efforts to, again, police the border better, mainly in the interest of the Guinea-Bissau authorities. But the export tax from Senegal will have an influence, and we may well see less material cross the border, which means more goes out through the port of Bissau, which probably means it goes out a little bit more slowly. Speaking of Bissau, we're now looking at a crop estimate there, 280 to 300,000 tons, maybe a little bit less than last year, but still a really good crop by the standards of the last 5 years. Trading has started, according to one of our reporters. About 15,000 tons has been reported traded. That was a figure as of last Friday. Quality is good. You would have heard John Rao 2 weeks ago talk to us about that, telling us that the quality looked good. And we're hearing that report confirmed again and again. Good to very good quality. So further west, quality looks okay. Maybe a little question mark in Senegal. Um, Volume looks okay too. Guinea, Republic of Guinea. So this is material that's exported generally through the port of Conakry. The estimate around about 150,000 tons seems good. We don't know the actual export so far. There is a delay on the figures. Hopefully in 2 weeks we'll have some figures on that. Quality is certainly lower, but that is it's been put down to a couple of different areas. So on the one hand, we hear reports of farmers and traders rushing to move material and therefore not drying it properly. But on the other hand, we hear that the actual yield from the cashew trees was a little bit less this year. The quality was a little bit less this year, so outturns a little bit lower. In truth, I'm not seeing that reflected in the international trade offers. They're still offering the standard quality, if we can call it that, from Guinea. And we need to look at that a little bit more. One theme that you may have noticed in the last few minutes talking about Cote d'Ivoire, talking about Guinea, Senegal, cash flow, the availability of money is a big factor. So where the money is, how the chain is financed. And that's something that we're going to talk a little bit about when we come to the main question of today. So where does all of this leave us in terms of our estimate of the crop? Well, we've got a little bit more optimistic in the past fortnight. We think that our estimates have increased by 1%. That would mean if you look at the chart, you've got your bars production year by year, then you've got the low estimate for 2026 and the high estimate for 2026. So yeah, we definitely feel that this crop is smaller than the last crop, but it could still be the second largest crop in history. The big question marks were initially over Cambodia, which seems to have been positively answered. And then after that, we started to be concerned a little bit about Cote d'Ivoire, but that too seems to have been answered. And what we're seeing is a really good crop, maybe not as big as the all-time record of last year, but nonetheless a pretty decent crop. Now, quality remains a question. So the big questions that we've been asking over the last couple of months are beginning to be answered. We're well into May now, and you would expect that to be so. So Cote d'Ivoire looks like a big crop, but quality not as good as last year, a little bit like 2023. I think this probably puts 2025 more into perspective than anything. Cash flow tightness is impacting everywhere. That's affecting prices, particularly at the farm gate, and it makes it difficult for the authorities to protect their minimum price policies. Production in Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Gambia looks okay. Production in Guinea, average to good. So we're looking at what's beginning to come online now in the last area to be harvested. If you think about, as I do, I think about the cashew crop in the world starts around about September, Brazil, Tanzania, Indonesia, and ends June, July, normally in Senegal and Guinea-Bissau. This year, actually, Cote d'Ivoire might, Burkina even might go on into July, from what I understand, depending on the weather, depending on the market conditions. If it does, this number, particularly the lower end number, this will rise. So pretty optimistic. And just to start the conversation, I know we're just still in May. What are we today? May 13th, but Tanzania is already forecasting another big crop from September. I was reading about the distribution of inputs, a critical factor in Tanzania. I was reading some information from the Cashew Board of Tanzania, reported in the news media, and the distribution of inputs, which seems to have been done well. If that works, we should expect a decent crop once the weather is good to average. And so far, no problems there. So all in all, the situation looks relatively better than it did 2 weeks ago. I think it's not going to be bigger than last year. That's for sure. But this crop will start to look a lot better than was expected. Now, how does that impact supply? So I thought, well, let's have a look at the situation in Vietnam. Let's have a look at the overall supply profile in Vietnam. And this will be at the end of April, about 2 weeks ago. If we look at imports, up 20%, a good crop, as we've said, typical opening stock, maybe actually a little bit lower than normal, the opening stock. Afloat material and Burma kernels still flow in. Exports slightly down. Exports and domestic slightly down on last year, although let's make no mistake, really good performance, but nonetheless down. That would leave us with about 5 months stock. That's about the same as 2 weeks ago. It actually calculates at 4.8, so it's slightly down on 2 weeks ago. Record imports for the month of April. Cambodia so far 806,274 tons reported by the Vietnamese Customs Authority. That's pretty good, you got to say. Ivory Coast already 100,000 tons. This is mostly older material. This is not necessarily all new crop. So we are a little bit ahead of the game, so to speak. Kernel's offers have been lower over the last week or so. Not particularly weak, but just offers a little bit lower, heading back to where they were probably at the lower point of this year. Cheapest offers that you might consider around about 320s, 315, 317, something like that. That's offered price. There are one or two cheaper ones, but I wouldn't buy from them. And processors are definitely, they need to keep buying, but given the level of stock, given the level of shipments, there's no particular urgency of it. And what we're seeing here is the impact of the increased production in Cambodia. But we're also seeing some impact of an import from Africa, an earlier import from Africa in some cases. So I thought I'd have a look at the top four in Africa. So Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, and Tanzania. Top four for the time of year, for the first quarter of the year. So looking at January to the end of April, first thing that stands out, of course, is that imports from Tanzania, due to a larger crop, due to more interest from Vietnamese processors, in the past 2 years have really increased. There's also another factor, and that is that the auctions were started a little bit later in both years. But 14% increase nonetheless, imports by Vietnam from Tanzania. It's positive for Tanzania. It's interesting for Vietnam. This is higher quality material, generally speaking, higher cost too. Um, and it will have a knock-on effect. Nigeria, a little bit higher, nothing special there. Ghana well down, that's no surprise. Ghanaian crop was later. Ghana is not a major supplier to Vietnam in any given year. It does supply quite a lot, but not compared to Cote d'Ivoire or Cambodia, Nigeria. But what's more interesting is first quarter imports from Ivory Coast, 96,000 tons, almost 100,000 tons. Now, that's not necessarily material that was shipped. That can also be material that was not custom cleared on the water in transit. Some of it could have come from India. We know India exported or re-exported about 85,000 tons. So we are seeing all in all a much better supply situation in Vietnam at this time of year than we might have seen in earlier years. Ivory Coast, 6.5 times greater than last year. Nigeria doubled. Now, they're not big numbers. Tanzania is a respectable number, but they're not big numbers, but they can have an impact. So generally speaking, the supply situation in Vietnam looks more positive than we might have expected, given some of the chat earlier in the year. And in that situation, with already almost 300,000 tons imported from Africa, over 800,000 tons imported from Cambodia, in that situation, you're certainly thinking, well, why wouldn't Vietnamese processors take their time buying raw cashew nuts? We're going to look at the Indian situation in 2 weeks, simply because there's no new data for India at this stage, and there's no point in talking about the same things again and again. So having looked at supply, let's switch to the other side and let's have a quick look at demand. And I'm wondering, and that's a question mark you see there. I'm not saying demand is softening. I'm wondering, is demand softening? And we just thought we'd take a look. Now, we certainly hear from India that demand for cashew kernels is a little bit softer. Cost of living factors, like everywhere. If you're dependent on gas, if you're dependent on oil, you've got less money to spend, and that may well be having an impact in India. The Indian rupee has stayed pretty weak, I suppose, or it's certainly weakened over the course of last year against the US dollar. That increases the price or the value of raw cashew nut imports. That increases prices. That may well impact demand. It may also mean that processors are a little bit more reluctant to make early decisions. What about China? So China really came on our radar in the last 2 years in terms of demand. And what we're seeing now is lower imports from Vietnam in the first part of the year. Um, that was expected. Certainly, growth was not expected at the same level. We'll have a quick look at China in a moment. If we look in the Middle East and if we take the UAE as representative of that, well, first of all, good news was that we did see shipments from Vietnam to the UAE during April. But if we look at January to April, for obvious reasons of the war, 28% lower. And that's the region is a significant destination for cashews. Countries like Saudi are not affected. Imports come in different ports. But certainly UAE, obviously Iran, Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, those countries are all impacted by the war, and that demand is not coming back. So I think I mentioned this the last time, but we really need to be clear. You don't defer demand when it's the type of demand for cashew nuts. It's highly based on festivals, highly based on seasonal demand. Once the season is gone, it's gone for this year. That means that you don't make up demand. So that demand is gone. Now, whether exports to the region improve as the year goes on depends on an end to the war and depends on the economic impact of the war, how negative it has been or otherwise over the past, I think it's almost 2 months now. Moving further west, European Union, well, we saw a great year last year, growth in imports up around the 5% mark. Now we're seeing that steady this year. Growth has slowed down. First quarter growth was below 1%. Retail prices, interestingly, in some countries, and particularly with the discounters, the major supermarket chains that offer generally less products, lower service, but really attractive prices, they've dropped their prices for cashews, both for wholes and brokens. And that's going to have an impact on demand. But it's not, by the looks of it, the impact of higher gas prices, higher oil prices is certainly having an impact in Europe. And the idea that inflation in Europe could increase this year is also going to impact consumer sentiment and could cause, I don't think we'll see a contraction, but I think we will see maybe a flat market, maybe very low growth, which will be the first time for several years that there's been limited growth within the European Union. And finally, then we'll have a look at the US. So the year started really good. Shipments from Vietnam are up 8%. That slowed down a little bit in April. There is some impact of the war. I was reading yesterday that US inflation now at 3.8%. That's a big number compared to recent years. That's definitely going to have an impact on consumer sentiment. Cashews for many people are a discretionary purchase. They can take them or leave them. They might be one of the things that they leave when we see more difficult economic conditions. If we look at almonds, which are much more reported in detail in the United States, we are seeing significant slowdown in domestic shipments of almonds. Big question mark over demand in pretty much everywhere at the moment. Quick look at the US in a little bit more detail just to see what this means. I've said that Vietnamese shipments to the United States were up by 8% over the first 4 months of the year. Flip side of that coin is imports, the arrivals. Not all of the Vietnamese shipments made during January to April will have arrived yet, but those shipments that have arrived show a good growth on last year. Now, last year was heavily impacted by the imposition of import tariffs, pretty strong import tariffs, and also the uncertainty around that. Not only the tariff, but how to manage it. And we saw a big downturn in US imports last year. I think it was down 27% overall tariff headings that cover cashews. This year, we're seeing a little bit of a turnaround in that. We've got figures for the first quarter. In the first quarter, we're seeing 22% increase versus last year. We see particularly March much healthier than last year, February a little bit less, and January was also very healthy, up 20%. But the norm is probably more like 2024. And the fact is that import shipments in the first quarter of the year are 12% below 2024. So what we're seeing, I think, is something of a recovery, but nothing like back to where we would have expected it to be. If we saw these figures without 2025, if we saw these figures, we would be a little bit surprised and disappointed. They only look respectable with comparison to last year. So last year was the exception, not the rule. Generally speaking, this is not good news for demand in the United States so far. Let's hope that changes. The other headline from last year, so if the US imports were down and made headlines for that reason, Chinese imports were remarkable last year. We saw a tremendous growth, and that has not actually been continued in the first 4 months of the year. So we don't have China's import figures yet, but we do have Vietnam's export figures. And as you can see on the screen, if we look at China's shipments from Vietnam to China, we see something of a significant downturn. So we're seeing consistently across the year so far, February, March, April, good January. This probably to do with the timing of Chinese New Year, but a poor February for the same reason. And then March and April down. So there is an indication of a slowdown. It's down 17% on 2025. It's not surprising. I don't think any one of our friends in China is surprised that the shipments of cashews have turned down. They pretty much told us that earlier in the year that this would happen. It's still, in the longer term, remarkable growth. It still looks quite positive, but it's not going to be as good as last year. Again, seasonal demand, once it's gone. Similar to the UAE figure earlier, you don't tend to see recoveries. In markets where the demand is more spread, the European Union, for example, you might see a poor first quarter and a recovery in the second quarter. You don't see that so much in markets that are based on seasonal demand because obviously that season is gone. So our conclusions then on the supply demand picture over the last couple of weeks, the crop is certainly not as poor as many people thought, or certainly as they said they thought earlier in the year. Inventories of raw cashew nuts and imports right now are adequate from a supply point of view. Demand is softening. It's softening on inflation. It's softening on higher costs. It's softening on disruption to supply chains, mainly because of the war in the Middle East. More optimistically, the risks to production, so the risks of weather as the year go on, the risks get less and less, and the risks to production are receding now. In Cambodia, in India, in Vietnam, they're probably gone. Still some risk to the remaining crop in Cote d'Ivoire, but elsewhere, I think we pretty much know where we stand at this point. My conclusion from that is that there is a possibility that prices could ease back a little bit, particularly and more likely on raw cashew nuts than on kernels, I think. Good quality raw cashew nuts certainly will be in demand. Guinea-Bissau material, Senegal material, high yielding material, I think will still be in demand. That may weaken demand for lower outturns from those countries further east. And kernels demand, if we're going to see growth this year, we need that war to end. That's, I think, pretty much it. The 3.8% inflation in the United States, growing inflation in Europe, economic question marks in China, and even bigger ones probably right now in India. And I'm going back to when this war started, and we spoke about it on this event. We said that it was more likely that the economic impact in India and China would affect demand for cashew nuts now than it did back in 2022 when the uh, Russian invasion of Ukraine caused economic problems in Europe. But now we're seeing a much broader impact of that. And probably, and I'm reading what economists are saying rather than drawing the conclusions myself, I think that the Chinese and Indian markets are more impacted this time round. Now, that can change. That can change relatively quickly, but I would be cautious at this moment in time. I wouldn't certainly wouldn't be building up big inventories, building up warehouses in anticipation of higher prices. In fact, I wouldn't be speculating at all on cashews right now. And that leads us to the next part of our discussion. So I've entitled this session, No Parity, No Sweat, Why Do Raw Cashew Nut Prices Never Match Cashew Kernels Prices? That's a little bit tongue in cheek, but I do want to look at this, and I've wanted to look at this for a long time. So what I'm going to try and do is try and answer this question um, without being judgmental on it, to try and give 10 reasons why they do not, and maybe why they will not, unless we see changes in the structure of the sector. But first of all, let's test the question. Why do raw cashew nut prices never match cashew kernels prices? So we said, how could we do that? How could we do some analysis on this without going into one of those deep academic studies, which do nobody any favors? So first of all, we said, let's see what we can calculate. So we said, we'll take the international raw cashew nut prices, everything in US dollars per ton or US dollars per pound. We take the prices cost and freight Vietnam. Why Vietnam? Because Vietnam is the world supplier of cashew kernels, 89% of the US market, 70 plus percent of the European market, 90% of the Chinese market. And we'll take monthly closing prices, and we'll take a period from 2021 to 2026, and we'll take the major African origins, and that means essentially all of the major African origins. We'll adjust prices month by month on raw cashew nuts back to £48. So if the typical outturn in Guinea-Bissau, for example, was 50.52, we would adjust that price down to compensate for the lower quality to get us to an average £48. Why do we want to do that? So we can make a comparison. Why did we pick £48? Well, if you take all the cashew countries that export raw cashew nuts in the world and take their quality and average it out, you will come to a figure, according to me, of something like 47.8 or something. So £48 is about right for this. And that's £48 per 80 kilo bag of raw cashew nuts, as you know, if you're in that business at all. And then what we do is we calculate an index for each month. So obviously in some months, there's material from Nigeria or Ghana or Ivory Coast, and in other months, there's material from Tanzania or Mozambique. And what we try to do is we try to make an index each month so that we have a continuous list of prices over the period 2021 to 2026, April for every month. Using that index, we add in competitive cost of landing in Vietnam and competitive cost of processing as the processors told us. So that's directly from processors. They would tell us, this is our cost of processing. And that's what we use. So we take £48 outturn, we take processing losses about 4%, we take yield by grade formula, which I won't go into the details of, but it's essentially what you get of what grade, and from that you can then work out a round number to give you a value of the 320s, and that gives you an estimate of the cost of WW320s FOB Vietnam. Cost based on the available raw cashew nuts. It doesn't mean the actual cost, it means the cost based on the raw cashew nuts that were available in the international market at that time. Now, this could be done in a much more complex way, but what we're looking for here is trends and indicators. We're not looking for scientific details. That's how we calculate. And then what do we compare? So we take the cost price month by month, and we looked at it in three different scenarios. Number one, let's match the raw cashew nut price today with the kernel's price today and ask the question, can we buy and sell on the same day at a profit? That's the question that kernel's buyer asked me that I mentioned when we opened up this session. Second question is, what about if we bought the raw cashew nuts today and sold them in 3 months? What if we buy them now and sell them in 3 months, which is roughly when they should arrive? And question three is, well, what about if we did the opposite? What about if we sold the kernels today, bought the raw cashew nuts in 3 months and shipped them in 6 months? That's essentially playing it from the short side if you want to use that kind of language. So we're trying to answer the question, is it true? Do raw cashew nut prices never match cashew kernel prices? And this is what we found. So first of all, on this chart, you can see the market price for WW320s, that's the red line, from January 2021 until it's actually April 2026. And then you see the calculated cost, and that's the gray line. So you can see that they track each other, but sometimes the cost is higher than the market price and sometimes the opposite. So let's have a look at that. The red area, that's when the market price was higher than the calculated cost based on the international raw cashew nut price. And you can see that it's not many times. And actually, when you look at it, you see that the market price is higher than the cost half the time, 52% of the months. But being higher than the cost isn't enough if you're a processor. So we said, well, how many months is the cost higher? Is the market price higher than cost by 10% or more? Assuming 10% it's far too low for the gross margin, but let's take it as the absolute bottom line, the absolute minimum gross margin you might accept. And that's only in 11% of the months. So what we're saying here is that based on monthly closing prices, if you wanted to buy raw cashew nuts and sell them at the same time at the market price, you could only do so in 11% of the months between January 2021 and March 2026. It's not never, but it's not often that the prices match, that they make sense. So let's look at the other scenarios. What would happen if you buy now and selling later after arrival of the raw cashew nuts, about 3 months later? So here you've got the cost with the 3-month time lag. That's the cost of 320s. That's the gray area. And you've got the market price that you're selling on arrival. So there's no gray area at the beginning because there's a 3-month time delay. And again, you can see that in this, it's pretty much the same. The market price is greater than cost about 50% of the time, but it is a little bit better because the market price is greater than the cost by 10%, 16% of the time. So it's a little bit better. It's not never, but it's still not very often that the idea of buying raw cashew nuts and selling kernels 3 months later actually makes sense on what we know in the international market. And the third scenario, this is the opposite side. So now we're talking about we're going to sell now at the market price. That's the red area. And we're going to buy 3 months later, and that's going to arrive 3 months later, so 6 months forward. We're going to sell today, we're going to buy in 3 months, but our sale is for 6 months forward. a much longer period of risk. And in this situation, in a way, taking that risk is rewarded. The sale or the market price is higher than cost in 60% of the months. But again, to make a margin of 10%, it's only 15% of the time. So in the three scenarios, very similar results. It's rare if you can buy raw cashew nuts, sell them later, or sell them later, buy them now, or buy them now and sell them now, and make a calculation. If you're a Vietnamese cashew processor, buying from Africa, this doesn't include Cambodian raw cashew nuts or Vietnamese raw cashew nuts, and it points to very, very tight margins, and that's confirmed by processors in Vietnam. What, for who is it different? Well, it's different if you process at origin. That's clear because you don't have all these costs. Now, why does this situation? So let's accept it's not never. We could change this question. Why do RCN prices only match cashew kernels prices between 10 and 15% of the time? So let's look and see why that might be. And I think the answers to this are very revealing for the state of the industry and the future of the industry. Let's have a look at some of these factors. I've got about 10, but there are probably others. First of all, it's a really long supply chain and it's really complex. And the processing is concentrated in Vietnam for re-export and in India for domestic consumption. 87% of the world's cashew processing in 2025 was concentrated in those two countries. And when we look at it, India imports 60% of its raw cashew nuts. Vietnam in 2025 imported 88% of its in-shell raw cashew nuts for processing and re-export. About 4.3 million tons traded, including African, Cambodian, Indonesian, and anywhere else. 3 million tons traveled 10,000 kilometers to processors or more. And when we look at this complexity, we're looking at a very difficult chain. Information is unclear, the infrastructure is challenging, costs are volatile. Now there's the clue, costs are volatile. And this is part of the reason why the prices don't match. Costs have gone up. We'll come back to that. It takes time for the product to move, it takes time for the money to move, and it even takes time for the news, despite the current speed in the dissemination of news. The fact is, when we look at this chain, or I think it's two chains actually, the chains are just not integrated. The international raw cashew nut chain and the kernels chain are almost operating separately at times. These are like old-fashioned commodity trading systems. Export traders at origin usually have little or no knowledge of the kernels trade. Surprisingly, many processors have little or no knowledge of the farm gate prices in the countries where they buy their raw material. Forget about traceability, forget about transparency. So we've got on the one side the kernels chain, which is basically a modern food ingredients business, and on the other side we've got this raw cashew nut chain internationally, which is like an old-fashioned commodity business, more like something you'd see in the 1950s than something you'd see in the 21st century. And they're very different. So we look at things like contracting terms. In RCN, it's spot, it's cash, it's hand to mouth. In the kernels chain, it's delivered duty paid, there's forward contracting, there's usually more contract fidelity, although not perfect either. Very different way of managing contracts. And that means a very different way of managing risk. And if we, as they say, follow the money, that's very different too. So cash, pre-financing, advances are really important in the raw cashew nut chain in West Africa, whereas in the kernels chain, we have credit terms, payment on delivery, payment after delivery, typical terms. And in the intermediary market, the international raw cashew nuts market, we have cash against documents or still in some cases letters of credit. Also, there will be a certain amount of deposits. So at this end of the chain, raw cashew nut domestic in African countries, we have a lot of risk, a lot of cash, a lot of pre-financing. That means risk. Risk impacts profit margin expectations. It impacts the ability to finance. At the other side, on the kernels chain, much better organized, much less risk in terms of your money, much less risk in terms of your quality, much less risk in terms of the counterparty risk. That means whether or not the people you do business with will keep their word. So we talked about structure and we talked about this kind of interrupted two chains. Connected to that is the fact that Asian processors, Indian and Vietnamese processors that dominate the world, are very poorly connected to their suppliers. They buy from traders. They are not connected to the local trader or the farmer. They're poorly informed on farm gate prices. They're poorly informed on farm gate costs and assembly costs. Traders, the intermediaries, finance the chain and manage the risk. They therefore expect a return on that. Processors have no control on the farm gate price and no control on the costs. None at all. They don't even know, in some cases, what the farm gate prices are. Or they read it in a magazine or from a broker, which is the same as not knowing. But, and particularly in the case of Vietnam, they often start the season short because they have to. They have to sell forward. They have to sell forward because that's what their customers need. They have to sell forward because their banks demand that they have contracts to prime the pump for working capital for that year. So we have a supply chain that's mainly not integrated. There are exceptions. Not transparent, not traceable. In fact, the opposite to the modern chain. And that encourages volatility and that encourages the misalignment of raw material prices with the finished product, in this case, the interim finished product, the cashew kernels. So we've got structure, we've got costs, we've got lack of integration. And then the two main importing countries for raw cashew nuts are very different. Very, very different. Vietnam, export oriented, looking at low cost, high volume, high tech. Cost tends to be a priority. The factories are big. And Vietnam has now, for about 1 million tons, got a major supply alternative, Cambodia. India processes for domestic consumption. That's the priority. Prices are much higher. The market is protected, way higher than the international market price. Quality is the priority. Indian consumers, well, they know what they're talking about when it comes to cashews, unlike many of us in Europe. There are all kinds of factories, big, small, modern, old-fashioned, manual, mechanized. The industry is now increasingly diverse in terms of its locations spread around the country. Some factories close to markets at the big cities in the north, most factories much closer to the raw material. India was a late adapter of technology. It's adapted now, it's coming very quickly, but it was late adapted. And there is, of course, in the case of India, a domestic supply alternative, a much bigger crop than Vietnam, for example. It doesn't have to be imported, but it does have to be assembled. So we've two major destinations. One imports 88% of its raw material. The other imports 60% of its raw material. They have different needs, different business styles, and crucially, different target markets. India has a relatively high price domestic market for all grades. Vietnam has an international market, which in some markets is primarily for holes, particularly the mid-size holes, 320s, and in other markets likes larger nuts and some, of course, likes brokens. Very different customers with different priorities, different abilities to pay, and different ways of buying. Sometimes India may be able to pay prices for raw cashew nuts that Vietnam cannot, at least cannot, and make a profit. And at times, most of the time, Vietnamese processors can sell for export at prices that Indian processors just could not compete with and wouldn't want to because they can sell it in their domestic market. The fifth point is again about the way we do business, and it's kind of structural too, but it's a little bit different to the earlier situation. We have what I call a trader driven chain. I'm not the only one that calls it that. That's about the way business is done in this chain. It's seasonal operations, migrant buying. By that, I mean that you send your group of buyers to a country, they move from country to country as they go on. That's not for all, but it is for some. The key calculation is the risk versus the reward. If you see big risk, you want a big reward. Every year is a new year. Every deal is a new deal. Risk is about counterparties, who you're doing business with, whether they will supply, whether the cash you've advanced will disappear, whether the contract you've sold at a high price will not be honored. It's about the cost of logistics, freight, loading. It's about policy volatility. It's a bit of a guess. Will the government actually suspend exports this year like they did 2 years ago? Or will they extend the window like they regularly do in countries like Burkina? Or will they ban the export of raw cashew nuts like Benin? Policy volatility creates risk. You've also got quality risk. And of course, over all of that, you got market risk. So when we look at the risk versus reward in a trader-driven chain, which is by its very nature short-term thinking, you're going to get mismatches on price. The priority for most traders, and certainly I was one, and this was something that was said to us again and again and again, how many times can you turn your money over? You've got a limited amount of cash. You can buy, you can sell, how many times you can turn it over as a trader. Not how much margin you can make. Can you make a profit margin and turn it over again and again and again? It's a different set of priorities in a trader-driven chain. The raw cashew nut chain is trader-driven. The kernels chain is not trader-driven. It's actually buyer-driven, but also processor-driven. But the lines are blurred now because what happens now is that some of the major international raw cashew nut traders are also major processors. So now we see, for example, in Ivory Coast this year, processors buying 700,000 tons of raw cashew nuts. They're not going to process all of that. Some of it will be resold. What was the intention? Are they taking advantage of the system? How does that work? So the lines become blurred. And that's actually what we're seeing at the moment. Now, if you take that trader-driven chain and you take the blurred lines and you remember that some companies have become huge in the trade of raw cashew nuts and in the processing of cashew kernels. That changes access to funds. You gain market power and you can support prices because of your ability to finance, because of your ability to buy and hold. Maybe we're seeing a little bit of that at the moment in raw cashew nuts, or because of your ability to sell and wait. You can speculate. You can sell it now and wait to buy, which would cause prices to fall, or you can buy it now and hold it, which should cause prices to rise. These major powerful companies can also influence not only prices, but also policy. And increasingly, they can control the story. The news we hear is determined by the people who wish to release that news. Unless you've got independent sources, and we lack them, thanks to ACA, we have a few in Africa, but generally speaking, most people, and we all do it, we talk our book, as they say. We talk about what we want, we talk about what we would like to see, we talk about our worldview and how it reflects on the market. We all do it. You have to control yourself. I certainly have to control my analysis so that I'm, insofar as possible, try to be objective. So when we see major companies being present in all segments, from the sourcing of raw cashew nuts to processing, in some cases, to the manufacture of the final product. We get an influence on the market. It's called market power. It's a well-established concept in market analysis. Seventh factor is FUD, FUD. Fear, uncertainty, disinformation. This is a term coined a long time ago, back in the 1970s, when what happened was at that time, it was in technology. So a new entrant, a company called Amdahl, entered the market, and IBM, the by far dominant business at the time, started to spread fear, uncertainty, doubt, or disinformation about Amdahl products. So that's how that term comes about. And in a way, we still see that in our business, not necessarily deliberately done by any individual company, but collectively done. Poor distorted market information, lack of official crop forecasts. Look at the earlier discussion today. I'm talking about crop forecasts. I'm collecting information from ACA reporters. I'm collecting information from processors. I'm comparing it to official crop forecasts, and they don't actually reflect each other very well. I tend to go with the trade estimates. Unclear and late policy regulation, we've seen that many times. All of the gossip, all of the rumors, all of the myth, all of the market manipulation. And that creates this environment of speculation, risk, and potentially volatility. And that's a key factor in creating a situation where the raw cashew nut price doesn't match the kernel's price, at least not regularly. And when we see that early in the year, in the first half of the year during the main production season, we have announcements in West Africa of regulations during the harvest. We've gossip, rumor, and myth. All of this happening while the harvests are coming in. Could we not have the regulations in December before the harvest starts? Could we not have the pricing in January before the harvest starts? As that's going on, at the same time, there's pressure on processors to sell forward and on manufacturers, roasters at destination to take part in tenders. All that's going on at the same time that the gossip season, the fluid regulatory announcements are going on. It's not really surprising when you start to look at it that the raw cashew nut price rarely matches the international kernels price. And policy is a key factor. So when we look at policy, and you may have seen this diagram before, I won't go into it in too much detail, but you can see there's obviously a wide range of different policies across the continent of Africa. The main supply of raw cashew nuts, 60% of the world's cashew nuts grow in Africa. But African government policy has a big part to play in creating this volatility. And what we've seen in recent years, and this is causing raw cashew nut prices to rise, higher export taxes, buying windows, minimum farm gate prices, the suspension of exports, sometimes surprisingly, and in one case, and spoken about in others, the idea of an export ban, which clearly doesn't work. So all of those things are increasing prices. The flip side of it is, though, that these are often ad hoc measures introduced sometimes at the last moment. 2 years ago, Ivory Coast, the famous example, reactive policy, so changing policy, reacting to short-term market factors, poor market information on the part of policy makers and regulators, smuggling, cross-border in Africa, it's just the norm. Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea. It's the norm. It happens. It happens why? Because there's a lot of difference in regulations between countries, but it also happens because some production areas are just closer to the ports in the neighboring country. There are a huge range of unintended consequences, and of course, policy changes because politics changes. And the political volatility adds to the policy volatility, and the policy volatility creates market volatility. And your raw cashew nut price very rarely matches your cashew kernel's price as part of the consequences of that. I doubt if that's intended. It's simply unintended consequences of the way the increase in policy has worked. We could add in an additional factor, and that is the differences in policies between countries. That's one of the reasons why smuggling across borders to avoid import taxes or export taxes, excuse me, is so common. Ninth factor is poor information on harvests. Okay, so it is difficult in a smallholder chain. It is growing quickly, but the official forecasts are really poor. So inaccurate. It's at times, you could do a better estimate sitting here than you will hear from an official body. Okay, I got to sympathize because we don't know the impact of climate change. We know that the forecasting infrastructure is weak, but we also see something that's unnecessary, which is political bias, national bias in estimates. We see crazy things. A disaster predicted in February becomes an average crop in May. A bumper crop in February, without any significant change on the ground, becomes an average crop in May. So we just have poor information from national sources, official sources, and from market sources. And commercial actors, particularly because we have a trader-driven chain, they see the advantage of secrecy. I would too, in their shoes. It's better that your competition doesn't know if you're competing for the same material in the same market. Whereas processors might share information and need to work together because there's enough for them all, traders can't do that. And you can understand why. The difficulty is that the chain is run from a trader's perspective. And when I say a trader-driven chain, I'm talking about the culture, the way of doing business, not just about the people who do business. And many of the processors buy from traders. So they've no idea on the harvest, they've no idea on the crop, they've no idea how it works. Not all, but many. And the final factor, or series of factors, is our business culture. So we have a business that is more akin to a bazaar than an international modern market. Short-term thinking, that's because of the history. The inequality of stakeholders, it's a smallholder chain. That leads to inequality. It's speculative. Contract fidelity, in other words, keeping your promises, is poor. Many contracts fail, especially when the market is volatile. Many people see the game as what they call a zero-sum game, a game in which my gain is your loss, your gain is my loss. There's only so much money. I'm going to take some. If I take it, you don't have it. It's not really true, but it is part of the culture of our business, and the lack of transparency contributes to that. So for me, here's a picture of the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul. I think that describes the cashew sector better than any words that I could use. So when we look at it, we've got a series of 10 factors. Cultural, structural, customer aspects, ways of doing business, some of them related to history, a lot of them related to the way money comes into the system and money goes out to the system. And it leads to this situation where on our admittedly basic calculations, the best you can expect is that the cashew kernel price will match the raw cashew nut price about 15% of the time. What's the impact of that? Well, for traders, it means more volume, greater control, and more margin opportunity. That's why traders have generally been doing quite well in the raw cashew nut business. For processors in Asia, it means tighter profit margins, especially in Vietnam, and we've seen that, and more risk. It would be the same in India, except for now, at least the market is a little bit protected. But that's not to say that Indian processors are making the kind of margins that they probably should make for the investment and the activity and the risk. What it means in Africa, and this is probably the greatest impact in terms of processing, is that there are greater opportunities to expand. The lack of functionality or the dysfunctionality of the international raw cashew nut chain doesn't apply if you're an origin-based processor. It doesn't apply to Indian processors processing Indian raw nuts or Ivorian processors processing Ivorian raw nuts because they're on the ground, they're there all the time, they know how it works, and they can buy from farmers' co-ops as they please. But for farmers, it's not so good. And this is concern for me because I see a surplus emerging over the longer term. Production is growing more quickly than consumption. So for farmers, it means greater unpredictability of the market and of prices. And as the surplus emerges, it means that the lower prices and that move could be exaggerated. And it's going to be difficult to defend regulatory minimum prices in a situation where there's a surplus. And for kernels buyers, well, essentially it means that the supply chain is moving in the opposite direction to the kinds of requirements on sustainability, traceability, quality that they demand. It means that the ability to manage, control the chain in the way that's required now in managing those risks is less likely to happen. Now, you could say, with one or two exceptions, it's their own fault because they have chosen not to get involved. Those that have got involved in terms of sourcing and processing have much more control and they can answer these questions. There are some processors that you can buy from that also answer those questions, but by far the bulk don't fulfill kernels buyers' needs. And it would be better for the rest of us, and especially the farmers, that they don't find that out too soon. Because what we're looking at here is essentially the system that needs to be reformed. So what would bring raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices more into line? First thing, more processing at origin. Without judging where that origin should be, more processing at origin. Process the nuts close to where they grow, and all these relationships change. The impact of the cost of freight, the impact of export taxation changes if you process at origin. And I think that this dysfunctionality is probably the greatest driver toward increased processing at origin in the market, much more so than traceability or buyers' demands, the simple dysfunctionality of the raw cashew nut and kernels market. You should, in theory, in normality, in business, be able to purchase a raw material today and resell it at a reasonable gross margin. If you do the job well, you should realize that gross margin. But by the looks of it, you can only do that in the cashew business about 15% of the time. So thanks very much to listening for that. I hope you found it interesting. Let's go back to Isaac and see if there are any comments or questions. Isaac.
Yes, Jim, very interesting points here. There are quite a few questions for you. The first one, how is the export ban of RCN in Africa influencing the prices of RCN? And the case study prices in Nigeria, Ivory Coast, and Tanzania for 2026, 2027.
Well, if you think about Benin material flowing into Nigeria, Benin has a ban, Togo has a tax, Ivory Coast has a tax, Nigeria doesn't have an export tax, so it actually makes high quality raw material from Benin available via Nigeria and probably a little bit cheaper, at least in theory. But it does have an impact. I think the ban is probably more impactful at the farm gate level. I think farmers may struggle a little bit to sell in the short term, but in the longer term, their confidence in the sector may be undermined. So if we look this year, it's reported that about 60,000 tons have been purchased by processors in Benin. I think production is probably about 160,000 tons. Official estimates are much higher than that, but I certainly feel that we're looking at a situation where the ban is exporting farm gate prices The ban doesn't work, by the way, because all it's done is increase smuggling. We've seen two examples of a full-term ban. One is Benin, we've spoken about it. The other is Kenya. And what happened in Kenya? It's a long time ago now, but production fell sharply after the ban. So it doesn't seem to work. I cannot believe, on a personal note, how a country like Nigeria even considers an idea of banning the export of raw cashew nuts. It is so far from good sense that it leaves me breathless. Isaac,
Ayumi is asking, or he says he's observed that RCN prices in Cambodia this year were at least 100% higher than last year. Is the lower quality of RCN in Africa causing higher demand and therefore higher prices for Cambodian RCN?
I think they were 10% higher, Isaac, not 100%.
Oh yeah, sorry, 100%, I mean 10%.
100% would be a problem. Good evening, Ayumi. Thank you for your question. I think that the lack of, I think there's several factors at play. I think first of all the lack of quality raw material available early is a factor for sure. But I think also that in early in the season there were some doubts about the West African crop in terms of its volume, more doubts than there are now, and they caused processors to follow it. Also, I think that it does apply in Cambodia equally to Africa that the market information is poor and that many people were reporting that the Cambodian crop was much lower this year than it was last year, and that may have influenced some of the decision making amongst buyers. Thanks for the question. Isaac.
Yes, Aswani sends a comment in. It says in the olden days, the prices were around 100, 1,000, I guess rupee. Indian currency was quite strong. The processors would get credit from bank. Transit times were shorter, so interest cost was lower and rotation of cash was faster. This has resulted in one additional middleman, the financier. They add $80 to $100 depending on origin. The companies who have their own capital, they save on this and they are able to keep panel prices low. You have a comment on this?
Yeah, it's a really good comment, isn't it? I mean, that's what I'm kind of getting at when I talk about market power to a certain extent. So if you go from $1,000 a ton to 1,500, let's say, you need more money. If you go from a rupee at 82 to a rupee at 95, you need more money. The more money you need, the higher the cost. Now, interest rates remain relatively competitive, but certainly the way our chain works, particularly with working on advances of credit into countries to source raw cashew nuts, this increases the market power of the companies that have that power. Naturally, they take advantage of it and they can hold prices higher. So therefore, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It is one cause of the parity question. It's a good point. Thank you for that one.
All right.
Isaac.
All right. Samuel says great presentation on the cashew production and market dynamics as always. What do you think would be the impact of the subsidy removal on processing in Cote d'Ivoire on Africa's RCN processing volume going forward?
Well, the subsidy has to have an effect. So the subsidy was, if you think about the subsidy going back to 2018, it's been remarkably successful in boosting production of cashew kernels in Cote d'Ivoire. It has led to a lot of, maybe the investment would have taken place, but probably not as quickly and probably not at the scale that it took place. The reduction in the subsidy this year, particularly for internationally owned companies, is going to impact their bottom line. The reduction in the subsidy, however, is more likely to impact the weaker companies. So stronger companies didn't need the subsidy. They were pegging it to their bottom line anyway. They're going to have to do a little bit better to make the same kind of profits. Weaker companies who were struggling to survive they will be most affected. So I do think that the removal of the subsidy in the short term will have an impact, especially on the weaker companies. This is a very personal opinion, by the way. This is not the opinion of the ACA. The larger companies probably won't be as impacted. I think where we will see the biggest impact of the reduction in the subsidy and eventual removal of the subsidy in Cote d'Ivoire is in the way investors look at it. I do think that this means that the playing field for other countries is a little bit more level, so that a country like Ghana, Nigeria, may well see the opportunity to attract investment improved. And I think that's probably where we see the next big impact of the removal of the subsidy. All of that said, the subsidy was always intended to be a measure to stimulate investment. It was never going to be a long-term factor. So we should not be surprised by its reduction and eventual removal. Isaac.
Yes, so the next question is from Esther, and she is asking if you have already concrete ideas on how to reform the market as it is now.
Yeah, Esther, it's of course a great question. I think many people have ideas. So what would I like to see? I'd like to see short term, I'd like to see policy and regulation much more um, linked to the market, particularly the setting of minimum prices. I'd like to see that much more linked to the market, better market information. And one of the things I'd like to see is better crop estimates and forecasting from the origins, all origins, that means. That's number one. Secondly, I think that policy and regulation should be earlier and more stable. I don't think that reactive policy or regulation does any good for anyone. I think it should be much more stable. And I'm not talking about reacting to a crisis. So if you got a COVID, you need to react. But in the general running of the market and accepting there is need for regulation, we should not let markets run free. There's need for regulation. And with the regulation, there's need for predictability. Those would be two things I'd like to see right away. Um, Reforming the market, well, better structure of the market would be better access to working capital, particularly in African countries. I'd like to see processors who buy raw cashew nuts buy more directly in the sourcing countries, as many used to do. So it's better, to my mind, a better structure if processors in India or in Vietnam are engaged in the supply chain in Africa to source their raw nuts. The sourcing of raw nuts from African countries is going to continue for many years to come, even though African processing will continue to grow. The raw cashew nut trade will continue. It may not grow at the same speed that it's been growing, but it will grow. And that means involvement by processors, better understanding, better information, better integration of the system makes sense. I would like to see cashew kernels buyers become more engaged in the system. Very few are engaged in the origins. Very few really understand, take an interest, or become part of an integrated system. But the requirements they place on processors indicate that they would like an integrated system. So rather than just demanding the end product, get involved, try to support the system. And we do see some indication of that. But the idea that buyers from Europe or the United States or China or anywhere can simply impose their requirements on the market isn't going to work. You need to get engaged to change the way the market works. That's something we could talk about. Maybe that's a subject for a webinar on its own. Maybe it's a subject that we could take up at the African Cashew Alliance in Accra in September. Thank you for the question, Esther.
Yes,
Isaac.
I think this we have one more. In India, we have more production capacity than domestic cultivation. Do you think it forces processors to buy RCN even if there is no parity with kernels or pressure from finance institutions to keep them going?
That's an interesting one. I guess it could do. I mean, on the one hand, Indian processors are probably under a little bit less pressure in margin terms because their market is a much higher functioning market in terms of the value of cashew kernels. On the other hand, it is a very competitive market. And of course, to a large extent, we have this variety of processors in India. So I think if you're a competitive processor in India, probably mechanized at this stage, you're not really going to suffer from this because you're going to be able to make some form of a profit margin. If you've built a factory and you're struggling to get your costs in line, if your costs of processing are still very high, you may be under pressure from financial institutions or investors to make that factory work, even though you're losing money. The traditional answer to this for many was to close the factories seasonally, close the factories, reduce the processing capacity. But that was often when India was a much more export-oriented processing country. So I think it's a factor, but I don't think it's a major factor. I think most businesses they need to meet their buyers' requirements. They can't turn it off and on as they might once have done. But at the same time, they're under less pressure in India than elsewhere. I think that the other factor, of course, is that Indian buyers tend to be much more careful on quality. They tend to be much less price oriented. So they have an opportunity to buy from many different origins in a way that perhaps Vietnamese processors don't have because they're so much focused on, more volume, tighter margins. Again, it's a good one, and that's something we should talk to processors in India about at some point. And you've given me a good idea. Thanks you for that question, Isaac.
All right. So thank you, Jim. The next session is in 2 weeks, and it's going to be a big one, the 100th edition of the Global Markets with Jim Fitzpatrick. What should we expect between now and 27th of May, 2026?
Well, for the 100th event, I thought it would be appropriate to take a look at some of the long-term trends in production and consumption in the industry, and maybe try to imagine where this business might be 15 years from now. Um, I think that's appropriate given it's a 100 event. We'll do that. Of course, if we have some dramatic market developments in the big time, we'll focus on those. But assuming the market goes as we'd expect it to, relatively stable over the coming weeks, is my expectation. We're going to look at long term, and maybe we might have one or two guests with us to brainstorm a little bit on where we might be 10 or 15 years from now. But for now, thanks everyone for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the interesting questions. Thanks to ACA and to all our staff, contributors, and interpreters. And I will see you next time. Thanks to you too, Isaac. Talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you, Jim, for today's presentation and for answering the questions. Before we go, I would like to remind participants to register for the 2026 ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, which will take place in Accra, Ghana, from the 15th to the 18th of September 2026. Registration is ongoing. Register now and enjoy up to 40% discount on all conference rates. I'd also like to say thank you to our sponsors, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Thank you all for participating in today's session. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.